welcome to you both. I can't wait to hear this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Deesha, how are you?
Hey, good, Jocelyn. So happy to be here with you.
I love hearing all the things, all the good things. Should I start with a quick reading and then we'll
Yes,
jump in?
please. Yes.
I was second guessing what I would read and I didn't want to make it too long. So I'm going to read just a little bit from the beginning of one of the short stories in my Monticello, Buying a House Ahead of the Apocalypse, because it's been that kind of day. I wrote this in 2019 before the pandemic, and the story takes form in the form of a list. So it's like little bulleted parts of this of the teller's list. So I'm going to read a couple bullets and skip ahead and read a couple more. Buying a house ahead of the apocalypse. Scour online listings daily. Find a house ahead of your 40th, ahead of your imminent doom. Never mind that a house is an investment, a belief that things on the whole will get better. Find a house on a hill set back from the road, a sturdy brick rancher, or a quaint bungalow that needs work. Search outside of Richmond, not too far from the city, since baby girl's still finishing art school here. Keep up your commute, rising well before dawn to burn up the road to Williamsburg. Never mind the long drive, the lights you left on, the busted toilet your landlord won't fix, which is always, always running. Catch the older lady at your credit union, the one with the smoldering accent, the one who makes the loans, the one who reminds you of your own mother, if mom had been brown and Latina instead of Black with an uhuru do hailing from Carolina. Wear your hair bone straight, a fresh weave with a tight itch of cornrows beneath, like something true but hidden. Tell the older bank lady you're earning more than ever. No need to mention it's a third as much as anyone else in your office, which you know because you manage their books. Confide there's a blazing cake birthday close on your horizon. Ask her, for real, what can she do for you? Check your credit score with that app on your phone when you bolt awake in the middle of the night. Scroll to see how swiftly the Amazon burns. Scroll to see how many hundreds of species have been lost or consumed within the last 24 hours. Scroll to see which items you've saved in your cart, primed to ship at your beck and call. Check to see if baby girl has written back yet, and make sure your long ago ex, her father, remains out west with all those states like a bulwark between you. Scroll through his newly posted pics, a fresh 22-year-old under his arm, her cherry pout, her mocking lashes, her wet doe eyes. Her gaze veers like yours used to, betraying that same ember of dread. Flip the phone on the bedsheets to dampen its glare and stare up at the blackened ceiling. Lift the phone again, refresh to see what might have changed.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's always great to hear someone reading their own words. And I have some questions about this story, but I just wanted to start by thanking you first. There were moments in this collection that were literally breathtaking. I actually gasped as I was reading certain scenes and certain lines. And I don't want to give away the spoilers of what those things were, because I want other readers to have that same experience, to have those same moments of awe where you take us in these stories. But I will say that the words that kept coming up over and over for me were audacity and audaciousness. Like, you really go there with this fraught history that we've inherited. And as a Black woman, and in particular a Black woman writer, I'm so inspired by your boldness and your imagination and your craftsmanship, and by the culmination of all of these, which is this gift of a collection that you've given us. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
And I noted that you dedicate the book, it reads, it's to my parents who had me in Virginia and made it home. And of course, all eyes were on Virginia last night and today with the election of a Republican governor. So I'm gonna start with questions that I had at the outset of reading reading your book, which is I wondered how you came to center Virginia. Did you start knowing that you were going to write a collection that and with these themes of belonging and survival with Virginia at the center, or were you writing individual stories that sort of organically started to coalesce around these themes and then you built a collection? So that's part one. Why Virginia? And then also, why do you still call Virginia home?
That's a good one. So why Virginia? I started writing before I knew I was going to write a collection that was centered on Virginia. And I just use Virginia because it's where I am. I know a lot of parts of Virginia. I was born in Northern Virginia. I went to college in the Shenandoah Valley. I live in Charlottesville. I've taught school in Arlington, Virginia, and so forth. So, it's always nice when you just know a place. There's things that you don't have to invent. There's things you just have experience with. There's details you can pull. At some point, I think right after I wrote the story Control Negro, which is the first story in the collection, but the second story I wrote, I realized that I wanted to make these stories like little pins in a map of Virginia that really dealt with, because that opening story really thinks about this idea of belonging. And it made me really think about this idea that Virginia is my home, but there's this way in which I feel outside of it and I have a distance to it. And some recent events have brought that into sharp relief, but that's just a constant. That's been my experience of living in Virginia. And so once I saw those themes in that story so strongly, I went back and pulled some other stories that I might include, and one of them is included here. And then I wrote forward from that, ending with a novella, which really centers Charlottesville. And then why do I still call Virginia my home? I think there's a way that just feet on the ground make a place home and experiences in time do, but I kind of have two homes because my whole family, including my older brother, were born in South Carolina. That's where all my aunties are, my uncles, my cousins. And when my parents first moved to Virginia, they would go home like every single weekend. I mean, we would like drive 10 hours with like pillows around us and like mom's tunes. It was like this constant pilgrimage. I think we went at least twice a month. So it was like very, very constantly going home. So we would go home to South Carolina and then we'd come back home to Virginia. And so it was this kind of two homes, and I would go stay with my cousins for weeks and weeks in the summer. So I think that is interesting to think about as an adult, the way that I feel about both places. My parents still live in Virginia, even though they still drive, they're in their 70s, they still drive back to South Carolina all the time. So it's just, there's something about just time on the ground, that place that you've been, even if you have a fraught relationship with it.
Right. And maybe especially, So you mentioned that, the collection is called My Monticello, but within it, there is a novella with the same title. Can you break down for us how that came to be a novella? Did it start life as a short story? Yeah,
so My Monticello is the last and the biggest part of the book. And it kind of took the name from another story. There was another story. It was going to be called Virginia's Not My Home, which is the second story. My Monticello is the story of, it's a reaction to Unite the Right in Charlottesville. And it's the story of a group of neighbors who live in Charlottesville who end up getting kind of ousted out of their homes by white supremacists, kind of like the Unite the Right rally that happened here in 2017. But in this time, this near future time of unraveling, and they end up driving up and taking refuge in Thomas Jefferson's historic kind of museum of a house now, Monticello, and all the grounds there, and kind of claiming it. So that story started as a short story. It was a long short story. I kind of had the beginning, the setup, I had the end, and a really loose middle. And I knew once I had the beginning and the end of that story, I knew that it needed more middle, and I needed to know more about Monticello. I needed to think a little bit more deeply about just the mechanics of the story, because I have to make it believable, and I have to make them surviving. Basically, this group is surviving in Monticello. They're using the things there. So I had to learn what was there and what would make sense. And psychologically too, what would keep these people, how can you believe that they might go there, and what would keep them there, so that the reader can think about other ideas and be in the space and not be like, why would they do that? Or what would this be? And also there's a lot of characters. I tend to like these kind of groups of characters. And in that story in particular, I wanted each character to have a moment where they could speak and where they could walk and where you got an insight to them and where they could do something you that you liked and where they could do something you didn't like next to that too. And
Right.
so I ended up kind of building it out, kind of telling myself, well, it's just a short story because I've written novels, but it's hard to hold all that in your head. So I just kept building out piece by piece, and then it became what it is.
And then one other question about the mechanics of the collection. Are there stories that you'd written that you thought would be a part of the collection that ultimately didn't make it in?
That's a really good question. Yeah, there are several other stories that could have been included that had Virginia characters that fit the basic idea, but either didn't pull enough to that theme of home belonging, of how history affects that. And by history, it could be family history, just it could, history is this really intimate small thing, or it could be history like literally they're sitting in Thomas Jefferson's house and she's reading, the protagonist in Asia Love is reading notes on the state of Virginia that Thomas Jefferson wrote in the 17 whatevers, that kind of history too. So they just didn't fit as well. So it was really kind of fun and nice to think about, like, what suits this the best and what are the stories that are the most on theme and on point for this particular collection. Like I want it to be like a concept album, like, where it wasn't just like, let's throw it in to make it bigger. I mean, I write really short stories a lot of times. So it was like, can this be enough? But I think the novella really, it pulled it all together and made it into a thing of, a thing that feels hopefully complete to readers.
And you mentioned a word that I want to zero in on. You said fun. And I think it's important for writers, especially emerging writers, to know that you can and maybe should have fun, and that bringing an element of playfulness into your process can yield really good stuff. Is there a particular character or story that you had the most fun writing?
So there's a lot of dark stuff that I was grappling with in this collection, but I have to say I had probably the most fun writing Something Sweet on Our Tongues, which is a story about, it's the middle story in the collection. It's a story about a group of school children, this group of boys, and they're a wee voice, and they're just like kind of wreaking havoc on the school day. So I was a public school art teacher for 20 years, and it was fun to imagine the world. Oh, I did this anyway as a teacher, to imagine the world from the point of view of the person who's the menace in my life as a teacher, but I also totally get it. Like, they're out there just like having all their experiences and seeing the world, and often being very insightful about what they see, and things that might not make sense when you're trying to wrest power and create this situation that looks very calm, make a lot of sense sometimes when you're coming into it and you have all your needs and wants and desires, and you understand how power works in the world, and you want some agency over how your day goes. So I actually had a lot of fun just being in their heads and being in their voice, thinking about that.
And it's interesting you mentioned that, because my next question is about that story. So you created, with the collection as a whole, what your editor Aretha Powers calls a symphony about who gets to call America home, which I really love. And as you mentioned, one of the key themes is belonging, specifically belonging in America. And so there's this loneliness that I felt was palpable in Control Negro and some of the other stories, which is like this counterpoint to belonging. And then I got to Something Sweet on Our Tongues, which is this really aching and beautiful story that, as you said, it's written in the second person plural we point of view, and the narrator is this collective of Black children in a school that I thought it was, the teachers were all white, but maybe not. And even though for me it was 40 years ago, I remembered being part of that Black kid collective, surrounded by white teachers. And we did have this shared sense of not belonging in that place. And as a collective, we resisted and we created chaos as a unit in these like really small ways. And you captured that. And so I wondered, I was going to ask if the story was rooted in nostalgia or personal experience for you. And you touched on it a bit by saying it's from your perspective as a teacher, but can you just maybe talk a bit about nostalgia and personal experience in general and the role it plays in these stories?
Yeah, that story was, I'm glad, it's so nice that you recognize some things in that, because it was really fun to think about that idea of belonging and who gets to say. And in that story too, I wanted the kids to really belong with each other. They have this sense that it's so important to feel a part of each other and not so much a part of this establishment. And I think that's a huge tension in the story. As far as nostalgia, yeah, it's funny. I kind of play with, in the whole collection, nostalgia two ways. One is kind of nostalgia as this nostalgic history we have for things that maybe never were, or that were horrible for someone else. So
Mhm,
for instance, in
right.
the novella, there's this idea of, a nostalgia for the past, and then the idea of, Monticello, going up to Monticello, this nostalgia for Jefferson and these ideals. But then when you examine them more closely, there are these ideals, and then there are the truth of what scaffolded them and the truth of what made them possible. Like the narrator goes up to Monticello and she sees, the pediment, and she sees the columns, and she sees all this beautiful architecture. And then she says she imagines black hands sunk in mortar, this idea that what did it take to get here, and what was part of that, what was excluded from that nostalgia, and what was excluded from the story to create something that some people could feel really good about, and what was excluded. For me, yeah, I think all my writing kind of draws on memory and just this kind of collecting of things. So they don't have to necessarily be so in the past, but I'm just constantly looking and collecting these little moments in the story. My Monticello, for instance, First Street is a real street that's really near my house, where I walk my dog, and I've pushed my son in a stroller when he was little and walked downtown from there. And so all these moments through my 20 years of living in this house and being along that street, and just being like, oh, I remember that kind of person, I've seen someone who looks like that, or, all the things that I imagine for the people that live there. And so, and the kids I know, the students I've taught, that I'm waving at, just that feeling of time over time, of these moments that collect, that mean something.
And to shift back to Control Negro, which is the story you mentioned earlier, the voice of the narrator in that story brought to my mind the voice of one of the professors in Rion Amilcar Scott's novella, Special Topics in Loneliness Studies, which in his second collection, The World Doesn't Require You. And Rion has written that novella was a way to dramatize what he sees as contradictory or absurd about academia, and he really skewers it. So could you talk about what the impetus was for Control Negro?
Sure. So Control Negro is the first story in the collection. It was anthology, and it kind of was the energy for me to create the collection, in the sense that it was anthologized in Best American Short Stories. Roxane Gay tweeted about it when it came out, and I tried to use the energy around that story both for myself, to inspire me of how can I create something that fits together with what's good about this story, but also just to find a home for it, and to try to get people bought in this idea that the stories could become something. It's a story of Cornelius Adams, this Black history professor who basically is hoping to test America's promise of life and liberty for everyone, including Black people. And basically he creates this experiment where he's watching his own son grow up, and kind of trying to almost from afar manipulate his child to be this perfect child, to see if all the conditions are right, if then could America bestow the privilege that these white students he has enjoy, and that he recognizes. So the idea of what was the impetus. So that story came around, as it often does, really backwards for me. It came from an incident of brutality that happened at the University of Virginia, which is here in Charlottesville, where I live, where a Black student was bloodied by officers. This was, I think, in 2015. So it was, in a long line of brutality against Black people, but kind of before we had really, we had Trayvon Martin, we had early Black Lives Matter, but it wasn't really the moment that we were in 2020. So it was me looking at that. There was a moment in the video, so that the incident was videoed. I only watched the video once and much later, but there was this way that the person, the boy that was bloodied, said, but I go to UVA. He was even though he knew, because later we heard all this testimony because there was a trial about it, even though he knew that things were messed up, he had this moment where he thought he could be safe, or that he would be safe, because, and it took place on this kind of super crowded strip of bars with drunk people are walking by the back of the thing. I mean, it's like in the middle of this carnival and he's like on the ground with blood running down his face. And so there was a way that I was thinking about the question of how do you keep your child safe? Like I was thinking about my own son, like how my son was younger, but how do you keep your child safe? And in what ways do trying to create conditions around your child that will keep them safe, how are those their own kind of damage? Even, and then in the story, it's to an extreme, but I think there is a way that well, if you do this, even if it's not about being whatever, about whiteness, but if you do these things, then you'll be safe.
Right.
There are no things, because that's what racism is.
Right.
You might do the things, you might not do the things. It doesn't make you safe. That's the whole description of what the problem is. And so I kind of took that to an extreme and kind of turned it inside out and created this professor who's running this experiment truly to try to create a sense of safety for himself. Like he's narcissistic, he's thinking about his own injuries as a child, and he's trying to create this world where he can imagine being safe, or he can imagine someone like him being safe. So that was my impetus.
And another similarity that I felt between the professor in Control Negro and in Rian's novella was this current of loneliness that seemed to, run through both of these characters. And again, they're both professors. And so there's this kind of, madness on the surface. They're both unhinged, I think would be fair. But then there's that subtext of loneliness as well. And so I wonder what your process was for getting to know this character, the narrator, and all of his layers.
That's such a good question. In one sense, he could not be more unlike me. You mean like I was like an elementary school art teacher with like paint on my face, like come in, like a chime, we're all gonna breathe at the door, like a very like open, warm. I did not run an experiment like this on my child. Like none of that is me. But I think I totally relate to that idea of loneliness, and I relate to the idea of just the psychological damage of racism and the flip-flops that the kind of somersaults sometimes one finds oneself doing to try to survive and also just to thrive in a space. So there's a way that I think the professor just wants to have, be settled and just can't quite find it. I mean, I put him in extreme, I put him in kind of an extreme situation, and he puts himself in that situation too, but he's an isolated person. Even the mother of his child is someone he does not have communion with. So I don't know. I think you draw on yourself, and then I don't know, there's that magic thing that happens in fiction sometimes, if you're lucky, where a voice comes out that isn't your voice, but it contains something that you can relate to, and hopefully other people can relate to, even if that character isn't them at all.
Okay. So you talked a little bit about the story called Virginia is Not Your Home, what ultimately became that story. And there's a line where you wrote, and this story is in second person, singular, don't accept the moldy hymnals, the marquee salvation, the wayward way that mama courts heaven like a scornful lover. And I just really love that line. And people ask me if my book was intended to be a takedown of the church or a middle finger to the church, and it's neither. I feel like it's a conversation with the church, and I hope my stories would spark conversations among church people. But you touch on religion throughout your collection as well. What conversation do you think, Virginia is Not Your Home and some of the other stories are having or could have with the church and with organized religion?
That's a really good question. Well, I love that. I can totally imagine, having read your collection, that people might say that, but I love that it's adjacent to the church, and it's about nuance, and it's about the relationships people have, and it's also about this idea of, in my reading, how we kind of the idea of religion and the sanctimony around it and the reality of human experience in relation to anything, right? Yeah. And I think in that story, Virginia's Not Your Home, it's kind of this second person story where the narrator is telling herself kind of the story of her life. And it's a story of wanting kind of to escape her name. Her name is Virginia, wanting to escape her hometown, to go somewhere different, to be somewhere different. I'm always both suspicious and awed by people who just change their names. I always think that's interesting when they're like, just call me Rusty now or whatever. Like, what happened? So I think I was fascinated by that idea of this idea of wanting to change these outward things to create actual change. And as far as her, and she wants to be like an intellectual, and she wants to kind of wants to learn French and do all this stuff. And so the church piece to me, just, I think it, in that story, I was thinking of it as just this kind of echo of this idea of something that's prescribed and has certain, at least explicit lines, and her wanting to just like kind of tear down all the lines and just not feeling like that is going to be her place. And I think, I mean, I hope that all fiction, and you know, in the story, there's characters like in My Monticello, there's this character that finds all this, you know, all this comfort from reading scripture and having, you know, and having that there. And so, and there's a place where, there's several places where I think about, like, my grandmother used to sing hymns, and I like put them in the story, just this idea of what do you do when you're just laid bare? There's a way that just coming together and song and coming together as spirit is just not, you know, like that's what you have, like that's super important. So I hope I have this idea too of nuance, and not, I mean, certainly that wasn't the project of this book, to think solely about this idea of religion or what the conversation was, but there are moments that I think that you could pull out and really and look at, if, you know, you could look at it with that lens.
And, you know, that same character who's singing the Psalms, she had, you know, the most scientific knowledge. You know, she knew the names of all the plants and the things that they could eat and so forth. So it's, you know, I love that science and religion weren't being pitted against each other in you know, embodied in that character. You mentioned names, so I have a question about names, and the absence of names both are significant in several of the stories. So can you talk about your use of names and naming from a craft perspective?
Oh, I love that. No one has asked me that. Names and absence of names. Where am I? Well, I guess in something, yes. Okay, so yes, I have a thing for names. I'm always looking up like the baby names list, like what is this name? Well, first it just has to sound right, and it has to sound like your character. And then it has to be the syllables have to be, you know, it just has to sound right in the ear. But then also, like, I like it when it has a little nod of meaning something, or at least just a little something more. I mean, definitely Virginia's Not Your Home starts with this idea of a character wanting to change her name. Her name isn't stated as Virginia, just Jenny, like Ginny at one point. And so there's this whole, you know, it's there right from the first line. They named you this, but then it's not there. In Something Sweet on Our Tongues, there's this whole conflict, this kind of very subterranean conflict where this group of boys says to the bus drivers, you know, that's the one with the school children, they didn't even know our names. And then it ends with something like, until he called us by our name. So this idea of who recognizes you, who really knows that, you know, there's teachers that can't say so-and-so's name right. And they're like, that isn't even his name, you know, and that rings very true to me about being recognized, about something rolling off the tongue, about something feeling familiar to someone or not feeling familiar, and what that means about being in the group or out group. So that's really big there too. And you're right, the King of Zandria also, there's this idea, that's a story about a Nigerian father who comes to Alexandria and thinks it should be called Zandria because his son's name is Alex. So he kind of like takes a parenthetical, pulls off Alex and calls this place Zandria. So I don't know, I think I just really like names. I think it's like that first way you know a person, and there's a way that you can play with it in a story to hopefully have readers get something out of that. I'm glad I really hadn't thought about how much
I started noticing and like revealing of names, because often it's teed up about a name and then we find out the name later, or it's teed up that we don't know the name and then we don't find out the name. So I was like, this is really significant, and it really, you know, made me focus in on how important the role that names play. I mean, I think about in the novella, Denisha's middle name is Hemmings, and there's this reveal, and so we kind of think that might be, her middle name because we get a little hint in the beginning. And then, I was anticipating that moment. So it built up this wonderful moment of anticipation and revelation. So that was really great.
I love that. And I just was going to say that also I love when someone has a name, but people call them another name, because like 100% of my relatives have like, have my Uncle Abraham is Uncle Bug. Like, he's not Uncle Abraham. I don't even know who you're talking about. And then sometimes people try to go back to their real name and everyone's like,
no,
whatever, that's never going to happen.
You are Uncle Bug.
Forever. And I love that. Like, so Denisha is Nene, she's Nasia. Yes. She has all these different ways that she's known, and who calls her what.
You mentioned earlier the mother character in Control Negro, and from that beginning, that first story throughout the collection, mothers warn and mothers caution, and sometimes their very lives are cautionary tales. And you wrote in Virginia is Not Your Home, motherhood presents itself as a dull ache at your center. Can you talk about mothers and motherhood as emblems in the collection? Yeah,
I definitely realized at some point that relationship between mothers and children really weaves through all the stories, even in Something Sweet on Our Tongues. Their mothers are like this unseen force, but they're kind of always, they're still speaking in their head. The mom says, you're growing like a weed boy. And then in my Monticello, the story of Denisha, her mom is lost, but is a presence. Her grandmother, her maternal grandmother is her her mother figure, but then she still imagines her own mother, and how these trilogy of women think about history and how they think about their relationship to Monticello.
And her pregnancy, which is
she's contemplating motherhood as well. I think there's a way, first of all, just we all have mothers, so it's just such fertile ground, and I am a mom, but also thinking about history. When I think about American history, I'm not a historian, and I'm really bad at that kind of thing, but I think there's a way we can think, oh, what's in the past doesn't affect us. And sometimes that's really convenient for people to think, but I also think there's a way we can think, oh, what's in the distant past doesn't affect us, even with good faith. But when we think about our families, if we're an adult person and we think about our relationship with our immediate family and our history within our family, if we were the baby child that always got picked on, if we were the eldest, if we had parents that doted on us, if we had parents that neglected us, we know that those things affect us as adults. There's no doubt in our minds, and these ways that we understand and are aware of, and ways that we sometimes aren't aware of, but we still have that subterranean knowledge that that's there. And I think I really like using this idea of history as this intimate thing to mirror this idea of history as this bigger thing, that what happened to our ancestors, that what happens in history, that all those things create conditions that continue to affect us over time in ways that we are aware of and ways that we're not. So I think I liked having that. And also they're just characters, they're just humans, and they have that experience. So that hopefully makes them feel more real. So.
And speaking of history, there's a character, I think it was Denisha. Her mother said something to her, and the way Denisha interprets it is she felt like her mother was saying, there's nothing left for us to do with that old history but bear it. And but obviously, in this collection of stories, you're doing much more with history than bearing it. And so thinking about how the process of writing these stories and writing these stories rooted in this history challenged you as a writer, changed you as a writer, having had those experiences, what advice do you have for other short story fiction writers who are grappling with writing through these painful histories?
Oh my gosh. Well, for me, I think the way that I'm built and the way the world is, I know they say you're not supposed to do this, but I totally react to my fiction. I think there's a way that I use fiction to react to the world, and that can be really intimate. That can be something overheard. Like I just hear something and it's agitating to me or interesting to me. It could be something that happened to me. It could be something like in my community that I see like kind of ripped from the headlines. But then when I react to it, it's going to be in a really strange way. So in Control Negro, this story of brutality, it really gets flipped, I think, on its end in the way that it unfolds in the story. And it doesn't start with that, and it comes to it from a very strange angle. So I think what I would advise people is to figure out what excites you. That's something that animates me, like to figure out what, not even an answer, but the questions I have around a thing about writing in it. So I'm writing in there and I'm like, this is really bothersome to me. This hurts me, or this fascinates me. And I'm going to write around it and try to get some kind of relief out of that experience and to kind of hand it to readers to sit with and to think about with me. There's a relief in that for me. The story I read, Buying a House Ahead of the Apocalypse, super worried about the world, the state of the environment. And it was like a way to like share that worry and think about it and look at it and look at my own hypocrisies around how I spend and what I want, my desires, and just all the things. So, so I would advise people to kind of pay attention to themselves and what animates them. It could be very different, the way that I'm sure, you know, for every 100 writers, there's 100 approaches, but there's something probably that animates you and excites you. And if you can kind of become more aware of when you're writing and it's exciting to you, what are the conditions you've kind of placed around it? It'll probably help you to be able to write stories that you are more interested in, that you have the energy to spend time with and to refine and to figure out. So that's what I would suggest. And then the other thing is find community. I think writing is so solitary, but slowly over the years, and I'm kind of an introvert, but it's really nice to have a writing group, a writing partner, people who will read and give you thoughtful, careful, but also, you know, really paying attention kind of feedback to what you're doing. Not that you're going to follow everything they have to say,
right,
but you're going to see what you've made through their eyes to help you to make what you want to make. So finding community and figuring out what excites you would be the two things that I would suggest.
And for my last question, before we look at the questions in the Q&A box, goes back to the story you read from in Buying a House Ahead of the Apocalypse. When I was reading it initially, I saw this line that referenced, you know, an office shuttering its doors. And because we're in this present moment, I thought, oh, you know, this must be a pandemic story. But then once I read the entire collection, I realized it, you know, you were referring to this sort of unspecified ecological disaster and you know, that larger apocalypse. But it did make me wonder, did you write any part of this collection during the pandemic, and how did the pandemic impact your work?
That's a good question. So the last story I wrote, so yeah, Buying a House Ahead of the Apocalypse is the most pandemic-like story, but I wrote that in 2019 before the pandemic. And I finished my Monticello before the pandemic. I was already editing it when we went into lockdown, and I finished editing it that spring when I got sent home from teaching and was home doing online teaching. And then we sold it that summer, the first summer of the pandemic in 2020. So the pandemic you know, there's echoes of it when I was editing my Monticello, which is a story that also has that sense of compression, because they're holed up, this group of, you know, 20 some neighbors, and then more people join them, are, you know, in a house up on Monticello, the power's out, cell phones don't work, they're very isolated. So it was interesting to edit it during that. I think I did pull from the experience and the feeling of isolation of being in the pandemic. But I already had all the pieces of the story, and there were a few things I thought to add that I learned in the pandemic, but it just felt wrong somehow. So I really resisted changing anything too much at that point. So yeah, the pandemic was there just for editing. I really didn't write any of the stories in that, but it was the way the world was going. I think the pressure of what the pandemic was contained in some of the issues, problems, and stresses that we had leading into it.
Okay. And again, inviting folks to add questions to the Q&A. I don't see one right now, so I'm going to ask another one of my questions.
Please.
First, congratulations on the book being adapted, or My Monticello, the novella being adapted by Netflix to be a film. And which I was, before I knew that, I was like, wow, what a cinematic book. And, sometimes I get the question, people ask, like, how do you write a book that ends up getting chosen to be adapted? And I didn't write my book thinking about adaptation. But can you talk a bit, again, from a craft perspective of what elements you think make it ripe for adaptation?
Yeah. So yeah, I definitely didn't write a book with any, like, I didn't even, I wrote a book definitely with an eye to audience some, and I was like, I do want this book to be published because I've been writing for a really long time, and I was like, I want this to find its place in the world, but certainly didn't think about film at all. I think that was a visual arts teacher for 20 years. I love images. And so when I write fiction, I often think a lot about the external, how things look, how they feel, like all those things. And that probably helps if you're thinking about adapting something that's sensory and that visual piece. I think with that story, it just really, it just was luck, not luck, but just the story just happened to be the kind of story that would make a good film, I think, in the sense that there's a lot of action. There are ideas, but there's a lot of movement, a lot of action, a lot of external things, characters that you can imagine, and dialogue that you can hear them say, and just kind of, unfortunately, conflict and
lots of tension.
And lots of tension. And so I almost thought of it like I love zombie movies because I think they're about the human condition. And I think that it's like a zombie movie, but the zombies are white supremacists. But then again, it's much more thoughtful than that because the zombies are not present much, really. Really, the story is about these characters and how they're going to create community, how they're going to survive, how they're going to manage fear, how they're going to manage care, and how they're going to have the night in the museum in this space and touch everything that's been held from them, and reclaim a space that they felt separated from. Because if not, a descendant of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, then who could call that home if not that person? Because on both sides, she has this sense of the work that went into that place, but also, the person who designed it and the people that built it. So.
And we do have a question. Can you talk about your process a bit more? Are you someone who writes free form and then looks for the road the story is taking you on, or are you more of a planner outliner from the get-go?
So usually I start with an image. Like I said, there's something that agitates me or something that happened. In the case of My Monticello, living through August 12th here in Charlottesville was traumatic for me. And then going to all these things about the history of Black communities here, which led me right back to Thomas Jefferson, seeing a real descendant that lived here, of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings stand up at an event about Hemings, I start with something, and that just was electrifying in my brain. And then usually I have that beginning image, and then I kind of free write, and I don't know, I'm like, okay, it's got to do, I'm kind of going, I don't know exactly where it's going to go. And usually I'll find an end space. I'll have a full draft of not a very good draft necessarily, but the beginning and the end generally are pretty strong. And then I have to come back and have a writer group and get feedback, and then think about it myself and fill in and scaffold so that the ending's earned and so that it feels cohesive and the character feels real. So.
Okay. And just a reminder for folks who have questions, you're using the Q&A box and not the chat box. So I'm seeing the questions, only the ones in the Q&A box. So what brought you personally to this moment and to this work? Can you talk a little bit about yourself? You mentioned being an art teacher. You're also a fiction writer. So can you fill in the bridge for us?
Yeah, so I was the kid that loved drawing and writing. For a long time, my my pen tweet was this picture I made when I was a kid, where I took like my 7-year-old school picture and I wrote, "This is the artist. She was 7 when she made this." And I made like an artist bio in third person, which I'm really proud of, because I was
Yes.
little and my handwriting's all crooked. And I think I liked books. I mean, my parents certainly read to me, and I loved making things. And those two things, that idea of story as visual and story as words, both really suited me. And I think I just could have done either. I'm very practical, so I was like, I would like to have a job. So I like became an art teacher, which I absolutely loved. I absolutely loved being an art teacher. It really suits my personality. It suits my sense of the idea that there are public spaces that we can share, and that
Mhm.
everyone can be welcome and everyone can have a home in that space. That's really important to me.
Mhm.
Even if we have separate communities, I think that's great, but I think there should be spaces in community where we all feel welcome and we all have things to contribute. And so, but I kept writing. I just really liked writing. So I kind of kept it on the side, had blogged and blah, 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 blah. And then at some point I just had this kind of idea that if you're going to make something, if you're going to write and put this much care into it, you want a sense of audience. So I just kind of started pursuing that. And for me, it was a very long road from beginning to pursue that to having my first book out, but I'm happy this is the one.
And a somewhat related question, would you consider creating a graphic novel version of My Monticello?
Oh, I actually, usually when people say, do you want to make it a novel or do something else? I'm like, no, but I actually think that would be an interesting project. I think it would be, I don't know enough about making a graphic novel. It would be a steep learning curve, but I think that would be really interesting. I've always wanted to have images or drawings in a book, or find a way to have that visual piece represented in the book. And I think that would actually be really exciting. I'm going to think about that. Thank you, whoever said that.
And can you talk a bit about writers who inspire you, who have inspired you as you write, or are you someone who has to step away from reading fiction when you're writing fiction?
It's hard for me to write when I'm read the same thing I'm writing about while I'm writing it, because I do think that voice can intrude your head. And for me, just being human, you compare and it just gets you in a different place. I think I have to kind of pull away. But I think all the things you've read and all the just how your ear takes in things and the things you love are gonna speak to you as you're writing, and it's gonna come back out in your writing and are going to inform your writing. But I really have to just kind of shut it off and kind of cloister myself away from some of those voices to be able to hear what I want to say, hear my own voice.
Okay. And when you're writing, and you've written, extensively about, slavery, and do you ever feel that in your body, like you're revisiting that trauma when you're writing your stories? And have you ever had to like just stop and call it a day because of that?
Yeah, my Monticello in particular goes there, and some of the ways it goes there weren't in that first draft. So there was a way in which, once I had this premise, I realized that I was thinking about the past and kind of bringing the past into the present, and kind of telling myself, how could this be, and what are the pressures that come to bear to allow people to do this, but more, what are the pressures that people who are in this condition feel? And I really thought a lot about my characters. She's traumatized. She's got a lot of the sensations of thinking about writing from her. I had to be like, how does it feel? And I think there was a way that I used to write where I really left out the feelings of the character and thought the reader insert them. But I think in this project, I really had to really sit with the feelings of the character. And yes, I do have to take breaks sometimes, because I think it's really hard, but there is an exorcism to it for me, in the sense that, again, if I can put it out, if I can speak it plainly, if I can share it with the reader, then it's not only mine to bear, and hopefully some people who maybe don't, I would hope that there's a way. I know for me, reading can create empathy and create a bridge to being in someone else's shoes without having to be there, in a safer way, to give me some access to how something might feel that might not be my life experience.
And you've talked a bit about process and that you've written novels before. What was the biggest difference you'd say between the process of the novels you've written and then the process of putting this collection together?
Yeah, so novels are hard for me in the sense that I really love how in stories, every little thing can point to every little thing, and an image. I love the way that, the spaces in short stories can work, the empty spaces in them, and just a single image. Like I think of the first story in your collection, Deesha, there's an image of this book opening or altar opening. I don't know, that just was like, yes, that is the best thing I've ever read. I love that. And I think short stories can really land on an image in a way that novels want more completion. And I think I'm an incomplete person in the sense. It's not that I'm an incomplete person, but there's nuance. I don't want to tie everything up in a bow. I want to just have it be, there's an openness to it. And I think that, so for me, short stories are my happy place. But sometimes I want it to be longer, like my Monticello, it was fun. It's almost like these little pieces that you're putting together to create this bigger thing, but I want it to all still feel like the language points to everything else, and every little piece hopefully is important to holding up the whole. So it's just harder for me to hold that. Now, I've heard writers are absolutely the opposite. There's people who it's so hard to compress. They have all these things to say that are so, that they want to get in there, and it would be really, it would hurt them to be having to pull it out. So I think it's just a matter of your ear and what works for you.
And last question, what's next? What can you tell us about that you're working on next?
Oh my gosh, that's the hardest question. So I had 2 things that I wanted to do, and now I have 3 projects in my mind, 2 that are longer projects, and kind of this idea of a collection, which I'm going to work on. That I know I'm going to work on that. And then these 2 larger ideas. One is a story that I wrote before that I knew needed to be longer, and I'm kind of picturing how it could become a novel. And then one is a new thing that came to mind, thinking about that idea as a family as history, and it's kind of an intergenerational thing. So that's all I can say, because it has to build and become what it can become.
Thank you so much. And thank you for this conversation. Thanks for inviting me to be in conversation with you. And thank you for this wonderful collection.
Thank you so much, Deesha. You asked great questions. You had me thinking about things no one's asked me. So I'm really appreciative of your thoughtfulness with the book. So thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Yes, thank you both. That was a great conversation. Great stories, great novella. Everybody run buy this. Buy many copies, send them to all your friends. Buy Deesha's book too. And it was, and I hope Deesha and Jocelyn, we get to welcome you to this actual Center for Fiction someday soon. And thanks to our audience, and good night, everyone.
Night. Thank you.